With her inheritance came the most powerful empire on earth when she was only 18 years old. A child barely out of childhood suddenly found her shoulders supporting a realm that ruled a quarter of the world, but Queen Victoria was different than other rulers. But her reign would shape an era, reshape an empire, and leave a legacy that resonates to this day. Victoria's reign, from the resplendent chambers of Buckingham Palace to the farthest corners of India and Africa, was defined by the themes of power, progress, and pain. She was adored, detested, lauded, and derided. But who was the woman beneath the crown? And how did she stay in power for more than 60 years? This is the incredible true story of Queen Victoria, the monarch who shaped an empire. Victoria was born May 24, 1819 in Kensington Palace, London. Her father, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, was the fourth son of King George III. But Edward was never intended to be king, and neither was his offspring. In fact, Victoria's birth came nearly as an afterthought, a last-ditch effort by the royal family to produce an heir. It was a time of crisis for Britain. King George's three sons had all failed to provide legitimate heirs, and the royal line was in danger of dying with him. So when Victoria came along, she was the inadvertent answer to a mounting dilemma. But Victoria's early years were far from regal. Her father died when she was 8 months old, leaving her alone with her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and her ambitious advisor, Sir John Conroy. Victoria's childhood was, from the outset, controlled, restricted, and tightly managed. Under what became known as the Kensington system, Victoria was kept isolated from the outside world. She never had a moment alone. She was observed, around the clock, at the kitchen table while she ate, while she studied, even while she slept. Her mother and Conroy organized every detail of her life so that she would not forget it and would be obedient and under their control. Victoria wasn't allowed to play with other kids her age. She wasn't permitted to walk down the palace steps without someone's hand. All of her reading, all of her writing, was watched. Her mother thought that by raising Victoria in a strict environment, she was empowering her to realize herself one day. But not. It made her more determined to escape. And then one morning, in 1837, everything changed. It was the early morning of June 20th, 1837. Inside Kensington Palace, the halls were quiet, the world outside still dark. But as the first light of dawn trickled through the windows, hurried footsteps echoed through the corridors. There was a knock at Victoria's door. A few moments later, the young princess received the news which would change her life forever. The king was dead. She was now the Queen of Britain. Victoria, at not quite 18 years old, was heir to an immense empire. Britain possessed lands around the globe, in India and Canada, in Australia and the Caribbean. But in spite of the splendor of her new title, Victoria was acutely aware of the truth. Nobody thought she was fit to rule. For years, her mother and Sir John Conroy had governed every step and action she took, as though she were still a child. And thus did the British government think of her, an untraveled girl, utterly unfit for the burden of the crown. But Victoria was about to show them all. Her first official act as queen was a quiet rebellion. She left behind Kensington Palace to enter Buckingham Palace, making history as the first British monarch to reside there. It was more than simply a home. It was a statement of independence. She was not going to be controlled anymore by either her mother or Conroy. For the first time in her life, Victoria was making decisions for herself. But her liberated life didn't come without challenges. She immediately found herself in her first political crisis, a crisis that would test her rule. The bedchamber crisis may sound like something trivial, but in 1839, it came this close to toppling Victoria's government. The issue? The ladies-in-waiting to the Queen. The ruling government at the time was led by Prime Minister Lord Melbourne, also the closest confidant and mentor to Victoria. But when his government fell from power, his political opponents insisted Victoria replace her ladies-in-waiting, many of whom were the wives and daughters of supporters of Melbourne, with women who backed the new Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel. Victoria refused. She regarded this demand as an assault on her individuality. But in doing so, she ignited a huge political scandal. Peel, enraged at her opposition, declined to accept the office, and the nation was left in a state of political turmoil. Newspapers said the adolescent queen was stubborn, naive, and reckless. In the end, Victoria had to concede, and Lord Melbourne was back as her prime minister. It was a bitter lesson. Even as queen, her powers were circumscribed. But Victoria was a quick and eager student. Gone was the princess confined to a palace. She has now been made a ruler, one that would decide the future of Britain. And soon she'd meet the man who'd change her life for good. Queen Victoria had gained her independence from her mother and Sir John Conroy, but her struggle for control was far from over. The British Empire was a vast, complex machine, with political rivalries and social unrest and a growing demand for change. When the young queen took the throne, she quickly learned that ruling over all of Britain was more than just an exercise in putting on a crown. It was about contending with a tempest of problems that threatened to rattle her reign. Her first significant political friend was Lord Melbourne, the prime minister who had advised her since the moment she became queen. Melbourne was more than a politician to Victoria. He was her mentor, her closest confidant, and some might even say a father figure. There was one problem, though. Melbourne's political party, the Whigs, was losing influence, and in 1841, the inevitable occurred. He was succeeded by Sir Robert Peel, leader of the Conservative Party. Peel and Victoria had never been in accord. Their relationship had already gone through the ringer during the bedchamber crisis, and now that he was prime minister, the animus between the two only magnified. Peel viewed Victoria as too politically partisan, too attached to Melbourne and his friends. The feeling was mutual. Victoria viewed Peel as cold, distant, and maddeningly hard to work with. But political rivalries weren't the only challenge. Beyond the palace walls, Britain was in flux. The Industrial Revolution had turned the country inside out, lavishing great wealth on some, but rendering others unbearably poor. Cities were bustling, factories were opening, and with them emerged unsafe labor, child labor, and massive inequality. On the streets, the working class agitated for change. This brought about one of the great challenges to Victoria's monarchy, the Chartist movement. Hello there, I am GPT-3, a language model trained by OpenAI. They thought the British government supported the rich and neglected the poor. In 1848, their fury erupted. The Chartists marched through London in their thousands, taking a petition to Parliament which called for change. The government refused, and the protests became violent. For the first time, Victoria really feared for her throne. She had watched as revolutions swept through Europe, kings and queens overthrown, monarchies broke apart. What if Britain was next? What if the people did not want a queen anymore? But Victoria withstood the stress. Unlike other leaders who buckle under the strains of leadership, she did not give in to fear. Instead, she began to evolve. She stepped back from direct involvement in politics, allowing Parliament to assume greater control while she turned to something else, something that would not only secure her legacy but transform the very image of the monarchy itself. That something was love, and soon she would have it in an unexpected place. For decades, Queen Victoria had been entrenched in a world of politicians, advisors, and aristocratic families who were always looking out for their own interests. But then in 1839, she met someone who was different, someone who wasn't there for power or politics. The man in question was Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The man, a German prince, had been deliberately chosen as a prospective husband, her cousin. But what started as a political alliance quickly became one of the most famous romances in history. From their first meeting, Victoria was extremely taken with Albert. He was smart and cultured, and best of all, he treated her like an equal. Bride of the British in an age when queens married for duty, Victoria married for love, except she was the ruling monarch, and in royal tradition, that meant that she needed to be the one to propose to him, not vice versa. And so, on October 15th, 1839, Queen Victoria proposed to Albert. He said yes. Their wedding on February 10th, 1840, was a lavish affair. In a form-fitting white creation, Victoria unwittingly launched a trend that would endure for centuries. Before her, few brides ever considered wearing white. But apart from the exalted beauty of the ceremony, this marriage was to define her reign in ways she could not possibly have foreseen. Albert was more than Victoria's husband. He was her closest advisor, her confidant, the man who helped modernize Britain. He promoted progress in science, technology, and education. Meanwhile, under his influence, Victoria grew to take her role as a constitutional monarch more seriously. Together, they forged a vision of the royal family and its role that was different from that of past rulers, one based on morality, family values, and service to the people. But their marriage was not without its challenges, even with the love they had for each other. Victoria had been raised free-thinking, headstrong, and accustomed to being in power. It was a leadership position that Albert was accustomed to, on the other hand. He wanted more power and responsibility, but as a foreign prince, he had no formal authority in Britain. This created friction between them, and sometimes they would have full-fledged fights. But for all of their struggles, they were deeply devoted to one another. Together, they had 9 children, and through them, Victoria and Albert forged a dynasty that would spread across Europe. Their offspring married into the royal families of Germany, Russia, Spain, and elsewhere, making Victoria the grandmother of Europe. But they were not destined to be happy ever after. Albert's health started to fade in the early 1860s. He worked late, sometimes too much. When their son, the Prince of Wales, got caught up in a scandal, Albert was deeply troubled, and he did not recover. Then, in December 1861, only weeks before Christmas, disaster struck. Prince Albert became seriously ill with what was thought to be typhoid fever. Desperate and terrified, Victoria kept vigil by his bedside, praying for a miracle, but none came. Albert died on December 14th at age 42. Victoria was devastated. She had lost not only her husband, but also her best friend, her partner, and the man who had been the architect of her reign. The grief was overwhelming, and as the black mourning dresses appeared, it dawned on people. Queen Victoria was never going to be the same again. Prince Albert's death had devastated Queen Victoria, of course, but it didn't prevent the world's biggest empire from getting on with business. In fact, the years that followed his death represented one of the most far-reaching transformations in British history. The world was shifting, and during Victoria's reign, the British Empire would ascend to unmatched preeminence. The Industrial Revolution had become a big thing, and with the new inventions came new progress and a fast-moving society. Factories came to life. Goods were produced on a scale there had never been before. Railroads extended across the land, linking cities together and accelerating trade. Travel suddenly became faster, more efficient. The new technology enabled messages to be sent around the globe in minutes instead of weeks. And with those advances came a new middle class, merchants and factory owners and businessmen who were upending the economy. Britain is no longer merely the land of aristocrats and commoners. It is the country of opportunity and realization. Victoria, who was still in mourning, understood that these changes needed to happen. She withdrew to some extent from public life, but kept closely involved in government affairs. Her reach extended to all corners of the empire. She endorsed social reforms, such as the reforms of the conditions in factories and the expansion of education. Laws were passed to limit child labor, and schools were constructed to serve all children, not just the rich elite. But while the empire thrived, not all classes gained equally. The new industry brought great wealth to many, but also profound poverty. In the cities, slums became overcrowded with families of every sort and circumstance doing their best to get by. Diseases proliferated in the dirty streets, and life for the working class was brutal and unyielding. But throughout it all, Victoria's Britain was the most powerful nation on earth. The ultimate symbol of Britain's progress came in 1851 and was like nothing the world had ever seen before: the Great Exhibition. The Great Exhibition was a spectacular show of human accomplishment, says one of 2 museum guides, standing inside the Crystal Palace in London's Hyde Park. It was a fair organized by Prince Albert before he died, intended to demonstrate Britain's technological supremacy and to celebrate the developments of the industrial age. Within the Grand Crystal Palace, a vast glass and iron edifice erected specifically for the occasion, thousands of the newest inventions from around the globe filled the massive space. Steam engines and printing presses, telegraphs, and even a primitive version of the fax machine. It was a moment of triumph, a declaration that Britain was conquering not just land, but progress itself. And at its center stood Queen Victoria, now the longest reigning monarch in British history, surveying the expansion of her empire to new heights. But even while Britain was celebrating its achievements, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. The empire was expanding, but new conflicts came with expansion. Colonial friction was escalating, revolutions were stirring, and soon, Queen Victoria would confront challenges the likes of which she had never known. December 14th, 1861. Windsor Castle's halls were hushed, save for the raspy breaths of Prince Albert. The imperious consort of Queen Victoria lay in bed, his body enfeebled by illness. He had fought off fever, exhaustion, and pain for weeks, but now, it was obvious, the end was near. Victoria sat by his bed, holding his hand, watching the man she loved slip away helplessly. She had depended on Albert for everything: his wisdom, his strength, his steadfastness. He hadn't just been her husband. He had been her navigator, her counsel, her ballast. And now, in the soft candlelight of Windsor Castle, she was losing him. It was at 10:50 p.m. exactly that Prince Albert breathed his last. He was just 42 years old. Queen Victoria, who was at a loss for words, wept. Her life would never be the same after that moment. The news of Albert's death reverberated around Britain. The subjects wept with their queen, but how could anyone know the depths of her sorrow? Victoria pretty much retreated from public life. She commanded the palace to be draped in black, and herself dressed in mourning clothes she would wear every day afterward for the rest of her life. The world was colorless for Victoria. For months, the Queen was in refusal mode for public engagements. For the government officials, the concerns escalated. Britain was at the height of its strength, but its monarch had virtually become an apparition. Some worried that the Queen had forsaken her duties, that she had been so engulfed by grief that she no longer had the will to reign. But grief wasn't the only reason Victoria stayed out of sight. She held herself responsible for Albert's death. He had been ill for months, and yet he had kept working himself to the bone, advising politicians, overseeing state business, fretting over the future of their eldest son, the Prince of Wales, who had just become embroiled in scandal. Victoria was convinced that Albert's stress eroded his health, and, had she pressed him to rest, he would still be alive. As the years went by, she was dubbed the Widow of Windsor. She was away from London most of the time, enjoying the company of her estates in Scotland and on the Isle of Wight instead. But as she stayed in mourning, the world around her kept changing. The empire flourished, new regimes took over, and Britain was making progress, whether its queen was prepared or not. But even in her grief, Victoria was not completely alone. There was one man who stood beside her during the dark years, a man who went on leave, one of the most controversial men of her reign, John Brown. John Brown, a Scottish servant, had previously been a personal attendant to Prince Albert. After Albert died, he became loyal to Victoria, often serving as her protector as well as her companion. Compared with the politicians and noblemen who surrounded her, Brown was straightforward and blunt and not afraid to speak his mind. He treated Victoria not as a queen but as a human being, something she sorely needed to be. Their relationship created a ton of rumors. It led some to believe they were secretly in love. Some insisted they had secretly wed. No one is able to verify these stories, of course, but what is obvious to everyone is that John Brown helped Victoria heal from her blackest hours. And for that, he'd forever have her devotion. But the world wasn't going to wait for a grieving queen to recover. The British Empire was at its zenith, and newer challenges were at the horizon. Revolts in India and conflicts in Africa and the rising power of other European countries meant Britain had to struggle to hold on to its preeminence. And Victoria, ready or not, would soon be dragged back into the public eye. For while she had lost a husband, she had also gained something else, an empire bigger than any that Britain had ever known. By the end of the 19th century, Queen Victoria had ruled over Britain for more than 30 years. She had survived personal heartache, political upheavals, and social revolutions. But one thing was the same despite her grief. Her empire was expanding. During her time, London was more powerful than ever. The country had ever further over the world. and in 1876 she attained a title no other British monarch before her had ever possessed, Empress of India. India had been ruled by the British for decades. However, tensions were increasing by the mid-1800s. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, aka the Sepoy Mutiny, had rocked the foundations of British control. What started as a military insurrection rapidly escalated into a major insurrection against British rule. Across the subcontinent, battles raged for months, and Britain began to fear for the first time that it might lose its prized colony. The British response was quick and murderous. The rebellion was stamped out, but made lasting marks on both sides. In its wake, the British government assumed direct control of India, disbanding the East India Company and bringing India under the direct rule of the British Crown. And at the top of that crown was Queen Victoria. Victoria had never been to India, but she developed a fascination for its culture, its people, and traditions. She started taking courses in Hindi and Urdu, employed Indian servants in her household, and became interested in Indian affairs. She viewed herself not merely as a queen of Britain, but as the sovereign over an enormous, mosaic empire that spanned continents. And then, in 1876, there came along Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, who suggested something which would go on to solidify Victoria's legacy for all time: that the Queen should be formally and officially called Empress of India. It was a bold move, an act intended to symbolize Britain's power over the subcontinent. Victoria was not a woman who took an interest in politics, but the title was one that suited her. On May 1st, 1876, she was officially declared Empress of India, a title that would characterize the later part of her reign. But, as Victoria rejoiced at her new position, India was still very much split. British colonial authority, however, did provide the subcontinent with infrastructure, railways, and a modern legal order, alongside economic exploitation, social inequality, and alienation. Many Indians resented British rule, and the seeds of resistance were starting to take hold. While Victoria thought of herself as a good ruler, to countless people in India, she was the personification of foreign rule. But in the face of increasing unrest, Victoria kept presiding over an empire larger than any in British history. During her reign, Britain ruled not only India but huge swaths of land in Africa, Canada, Australia, and the Caribbean. The sun never set upon the British Empire, and Victoria presided over it all. But it was expensive to rule such a great empire. Wars broke out across Britain's empire, from the Anglo-Zulu War in South Africa to the Second Afghan War in Central Asia. So retaining control of these lands involved military force, diplomacy, and unceasing political maneuvering. In her later years, Victoria was no longer the young queen who once ruled with Albert. She had evolved into an almost mythical ruler, revered by her subject, feared by her enemies, and respected by world leaders. She reigned longer than any British monarch before her, but her time was slowly running out. When she entered her final years, the world she had created around her was changing. She was now encountering new challenges to the empire she had built, and soon, Britain would have to brace for the inevitable, the end of the Victorian era. By the late 19th century, Queen Victoria had been on the throne for more than 50 years, longer than any British monarch had before her. She had weathered revolutions, wars, and heartbreak. She had lived to see the world change around her, from the earliest days of steam engines to the coming of electricity. But as she aged, one constant remained: Victoria wouldn't abdicate. Most monarchs would have abdicated or handed power to the next generation, but Victoria was far from that. To her, the throne was a sacred calling, a vocation from which she could never emancipate herself. She wasn't just a queen anymore. She was an institution, a living symbol of Britain's power. And yet, notwithstanding her profile as the grandmother of Europe, her twilight years were not without controversy. The growing demand for social and political reform was one of the biggest challenges of her later reign, the Queen said. The British people had grown weary of being governed by a tyrannical monarch. Parliament was strengthening, and the call for democracy was blossoming. The House of Commons, once just an advisory body, was now making major decisions, and the monarchy's power was waning. Despite her conservative nature, Victoria was open to these changes. She understood that the monarchy needed to change in order to survive. She did not resist. She adapted, shaping the British royal family into a constitutional monarchy, one that worked with the government rather than above it. This decision would firmly establish the British monarchy for generations to come. But as Britain drifted toward democracy, tensions within the empire continued to fester. Wars and conflict were springing up in Victoria's territories, especially the Boer War in South Africa, measuring both Britain's military muscle and political will. Despite her age, Victoria remained deeply engaged, penning letters to her generals, issuing orders, and expressing unwavering support for her troops. While her loyalty to the empire was undiminished, she was beginning to fail physically. By the late 1890s, Victoria was in her 80s, and her previously indomitable health was dwindling. She had arthritis, could barely walk, and used a wheelchair. But she was not going to slow down. She continued seeing world leaders, attending state functions, and overseeing the affairs of the empire. The end of the 19th century was drawing near, and the world was readying itself for the unavoidable, the death of a queen who had defined an epoch. Victoria had outlived her husband, her closest advisors, and even some of her own children. She had outlasted all others before her to become the longest-serving monarch in British history, and her legacy had been secure. But time, even for a queen, was immutable. And in the early days of 1901, after more than 6 decades on the throne, the long reign of Queen Victoria was indeed finally coming to an end. Queen Victoria had ruled an extraordinary 63 years by the beginning of 1901. She had seen industry flourish, the British Empire expand, and a new century emerge. But even the longest monarchy in British history had to end. And when the cold days of January fell over England, it was clear Queen Victoria was out of time. Her health had been going downhill for months. She'd lost her appetite, her eyesight was dimming, and her memory was slipping. The Queen had indeed once ruled over an empire, and her rule had been strong. Doctors and family members huddled around her, attempting to soothe her as she oscillated between periods of lucidity and hallucinations. Despite a failing body, she was as determined as ever, sending letters and holding meetings until, at last, she no longer had the strength. By the middle of January, she couldn't get out of bed anymore. Her doctors validated what everyone already feared. Victoria was dying. News of her passing spread fast, and across Britain, people prepared for the close of an era. The woman who had reigned for nearly all of their lives, the queen who had become a symbol of British authority, was about to draw her last breath. We are sad to announce that on January 22nd, 1901 at Osborne House, Isle of Wight, our most gracious sovereign lady, Queen Victoria, died. She was 81 years old. By her bedside were her children and grandchildren, notably her eldest son, Albert Edward, who would become King Edward VII, and her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. Her long life, one of triumphs, tragedies, and historic accomplishments, had come to a peaceful close. The entire world mourned. Black banners were hung across Britain and the Empire. Church bells tolled and millions turned out in mourning. Newspapers announced the end of an age. The Victorian age was done. Her funeral took place on February 2nd, 1901, and it was like none that had ever been seen in Britain. Victoria did not, however, let that wish stop her from being dressed in black. Instead, she wore white, the color she had worn on her wedding day, and was laid in a white coffin. Next to her, she asked that several mementos of Prince Albert be laid, among them his dressing gown and a plaster cast of his hand. Even in death, she was devoted to the man she had loved so much. All along the way, as her coffin was borne through the streets, thousands lined the roads, some watching silently as the woman who helped mold their empire was laid to rest. She was laid to rest next to Prince Albert in the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore, finally reunited with the man she had never ceased to grieve for. And thus ended the life of Queen Victoria. But she was not done. Far from it. Her life had not closed in on her. The empire of which she had been empress, the social changes she had seen and overseen, and the monarchy she had remade would live on far longer than she would. She had been more than a queen. She had been an era, a force of history, a symbol of Britain itself. With the death of Queen Victoria, Britain and the world said goodbye to more than a ruler. They bid adieu to an entire age. The Victorian age had been characterized by industry, empire, and expansion. It had survived revolutions in technology, society, and world politics. And at the center of it all was one woman, Queen Victoria, the longest reigning monarch in British history at the time. But what was the real legacy of Victoria? Was she a great queen, or just a puppet? Many have debated whether she solidified the empire, or her machinations sowed the seeds for future wars. In order to answer these questions, we have to consider the legacy she left. The British monarchy before Victoria was perceived as remote, elitist, and at times corrupt. Kings and queens lived extravagantly, detached from their people. But Victoria changed that. She and Prince Albert forged a new image for the royal family, one centered around morality, family values, and duty. She became a maternal figure for her country, someone the country could connect with, respect, and look up to. This change helped ensure that the British monarchy survived at a moment when many European monarchies were falling apart. Victoria set an example that still resonates with the modern British royal family today. Royal engagement with the public, their role as symbols of unity, even the customs surrounding royal weddings, can all be traced back to her influence. Victoria's influence extended far beyond Britain. She linked royal families across Europe through her 9 children. Her descendants sat on the thrones of Germany, Russia, Spain, and numerous other countries. In fact, several of the leaders who would sit across from each other in World War I were all her grandchildren, including King George V of Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. This net of royal relations gave her the nickname, the Grandmother of Europe. But in a cruel twist of fate, she who sought to unite Europe through marriages would see her own grandchildren spring to opposite sides of one of the bloodiest wars in history. Victoria's reign was the height of the British Empire. By the early 20th century, Britain ruled over nearly a quarter of the world's land and population. Her title, Empress of India, reflected Britain's subjugation of its colonies. But that expansion came with a price. While British rule introduced infrastructure, education, and industry to many areas, it also resulted in economic exploitation, social disparity, and nationalist movements that would go on to advocate for independence. The legacy of British imperialism during Victoria's reign remains a matter of debate up to this day. Some view her as a sign of progress, while others view her as a sign of colonial oppression. Victoria's name is forever associated with the age in which she reigned, the Victorian Age. It was an era of tremendous advancement in science, medicine, and industry. The theory of evolution was introduced by Charles Darwin. The telephone invented, railways changed the world. Women started to demand their rights. The working class clamored for reform. The world was progressing. And while Victoria was often averse to change, she reigned through it all. Even now, Victorian architecture, literature, and traditions still shape contemporary society. From the impressive buildings in London to traditional novels by Charles Dickens, her mark is still visible all around us. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, the world entered into a new century without her. Her son, King Edward VII, succeeded her, launching the Edwardian Era, a time that would be far shorter and characterized by rapid shifts to modernity. In a few years, the world would be at war, and the old European monarchies that Victoria had helped bring together would start to disintegrate. But her legacy remained. She had reigned for longer than any British monarch before her, a record that would not be broken until Queen Elizabeth II came along for a century and a half more. She had lived through the rise of modern Britain and had shaped the character of the monarchy itself. Was Queen Victoria thus a great ruler? It depends on how we look at her. She was a monarch who championed tradition but reigned during a period of transition. She was a woman who loved fiercely but suffered greatly. She built an empire but also inspired independence movements. Ultimately, her narrative is not merely one of a monarch, but a story of an empire, of a people, and of a world changing before her very eyes. And while she may now be dead, the shadow of her rule continues to define our world.